Dear community, if you are already tired of seeing Python literally everywhere in the context of AI, today we will do something different. We will code our own AI chat in JavaScript. We can use any model via the OpenAI API. It could be GPT-4o, the new O3 Mini, Deepseek, or one of Llama's models. It doesn't matter. The API is the same. Importantly, we will not be using Node.js here. Only 100% client-side JavaScript, without any additional libraries. We will create an HTML containing JavaScript, which will be a fully functional application. I will explain everything from scratch, and I think it will be a good introduction to creating various client-side AI applications. You'll see that even with just a web browser, you can do a lot. Alright, so without further ado, let's get to the point. To create the AI chat application, you'll definitely need access to a large language model. This could be one installed locally, but I'm going to use the Groq platform because it provides easy and free access. That's probably why they're becoming more and more popular, and why there's such a large developer community around them. I'm not going to go into details about the Groq platform and its benefits right now, since I've already covered that. If you're interested, I suggest checking out my channel. You'll find a video on writing your first AI program in Python. It's a different language, but the Groq platform is still the same. Alternatively, using the Deepseek R1 model instead of Groq platform is perfectly fine, especially since it's been gaining a lot of popularity recently. Just keep in mind that it is cheap, but not free. Sure thing, you can always go back to the source and use the OpenAI platform with one of their models. That's a solid option too, but keep in mind you'll have to pay for token usage. Out of these three options, Groq is the only one that's free for developers. Alright, let's dive into the coding part because I know that's what you're all here for. You're not here to just listen to me talk about platforms with large language models, right? I typically use Visual Studio Code and highly recommend it. However, you can choose any editor you prefer. HTML and JavaScript can be developed in nearly any text editor. I've already set up my directory, and I'm beginning with the HTML by creating an index.html file. An HTML file follows a specific structure, so the first thing I do is create the HTML and head tags to set up the headers. With the title tag, I'm setting the title as Sapdalf's AI Chat. This will show up at the top of my browser. I'm also specifying the character set as Unicode, although that's likely the default setting these days. That's all I need from the document's metadata for now. So, let's move on to defining the body of the HTML file. Thankfully, these days we don't have to stress about how a document looks when creating HTML. We just focus on defining the elements correctly, and CSS takes care of the appearance. First, I'll set up the header with my application's title. This one will be displayed. It is not metadata. Right below the title, I want a text field where I can type in my prompt. I'm assigning it an ID so I can reference it later. The app definitely needs a button for sending a prompt to the model. I will also need some kind of placeholder where the artificial intelligence response will appear in the future. I need to assign an identifier so that I can refer to this element in the future. I will also define the text that will be visible before the response appears. These are all the elements I need to run my first AI application in JavaScript. One more thing. I'm going to make the text a bit bigger so that people on mobile devices can see it more easily. Sorry for not doing that sooner. By the way, I have a question for you. Is the dark theme in Visual Studio Code easy to read? Or would you prefer dark text on a light background? Please let me know in the comments. Alright, since part of the work is done, it's probably worth checking it. It's a good idea to occasionally make sure there are no errors, and everything is displaying correctly. That's why I open the saved index.html file in a web browser. All the elements we expected to see are showing up, so that's fine. The design might not be very modern, but I'll handle that later. Right now, it's more important to concentrate on the application engine. To start, I'm going to create a new file with some JavaScript code. The code will be responsible for sending requests to the LLM, so that's what I named the file. If you've seen my earlier videos on AI programming, you're likely familiar with the three essential components you always need. First, an API key from the LLM provider. Next, the API URL, which serves as our endpoint. And lastly, the model name. These three parameters determine where we run the model. Let's leave these constants as placeholders to fill in later and start defining the function. I define the function as asynchronous because I'll be using the await statement to wait for a response from the LLM. My function will accept only one parameter, the input, which in this case will be the entire prompt, and in the future, a part of it. Right now, I'm just setting up the basic outline of the function. Since it deals with network connections, handling errors is crucial. So, I'll include a try statement to catch any errors and return an error message if something goes wrong. I'll add the rest of the details later. I've gotten so used to Python lately that I forget about semicolons. I need to add them to my constants definitions. Alright, let's step away from programming for a moment and fill in those missing constants. I'm going to open the Groq developer console and generate an API key. You likely remember this console from my last video, so I won't go over it again. Let's jump straight into generating the key. I've generated a key and copied it to the clipboard. Just a quick reminder, as usual, keep your keys secret. Don't share them with anyone, even if they're offering a free service. Okay, the key has been pasted into the code. Now I need the endpoint. Let me check the documentation real quick to remind myself. We've used it before in the previous video about our first Python program, but there's no need to clutter your memory with URLs. Here's the documentation for chat completion. There is an example in JavaScript, but it primarily focuses on Node.js, using the Groq SDK. Therefore, I'm going to concentrate more on a generic curl example. I'm going to copy the endpoint URL and paste it into my code. So right now, the only thing I'm missing is the model name, which was also shown in the example. It just so happens that the example uses the model I wanted to demonstrate. Keep in mind that Groq provides many more models to choose from. You might remember that we used Llama 3.3 in the Python program. I already have all the data I need, but I'd like to check once more the sample program to understand how model invocation works so I can write my function. The -h option adds headers. In this case, they have set the content type to application/JSON and also included bearer type authorization with an API key. Option D means that it is a post method and the data is sent, as we can see, as JSON. As we discussed in earlier videos, prompts are always sent to the chat in the form of a message history. In this example, we have only one message from the user with specific content. The response is also pretty interesting for us. It's a complex JSON object, but we're only going to focus on one of its elements. Let's take a look at the main object. There's an array called choices, and we're going to grab just the first element from it. Inside, there's a message object with two keys, role and content. It's the content that will be the substance of our response. And knowing all this, we are now ready to finally define our sendRequest function. Inside the try block, we'll define the response as the result of the fetch function. Keep in mind that this function returns a promise, which is why I use the keyword await to get the final value once the connection is finished. The fetch function requires two parameters. The first one is the URL, which is our endpoint. The second is an object that specifies the connection options. Here we need to mimic what was shown in the example in the Groq documentation. First of all, the HTTP protocol method, in this case, is post. In the example from the documentation, they also showed two headers, one for content type and another for authorization. It is important not to make a typo here, because something might not work as expected. These days, it's really common to use API keys for authentication. Alright, that's the headers taken care of. Now we just need to send the content. But before we do, let's check the documentation to make sure everything's correct. We have the post method. The content type is specified in the headers, and the authorization bearer is also set. Now, in the content, I'll start by defining the model, followed by the messages. And it all needs to be in JSON format. I've got two options here. I can either manually define the JSON, which is pretty easy to mess up, or I can use a JavaScript object and then convert it to JSON. This is definitely the better way to go. So I need an object now. First goes the model, which is already defined as a model constant at the beginning of our file. Next is the message array. In our case, it contains only one message, but two keys, role and content. The content here will be the argument of our function, which is the input variable. This is the text that the user will type into the application. As you can see, it is the same variable as in the function definition. Well, so we need to do something to actually send that input, and that needs to be handled in the index.html file. I will add an onClick event handler that will call a send function. Of course, this function still needs to be coded. There is also a lack of reference to the sendRequest.js file, and I will load this file first. Now I need to write a script to handle the click event. Sure, I could put it in a separate file or in sendRequest.js, but I think it'll be clearer if I do it right here. I'm defining an asynchronous function called send with no parameters, and it will be triggered when you click the button. I need to get the value entered in the text area with the input ID, so I'm locating this element using its identifier. I'm getting the content using the value property. I also plan to perform operations on the div element with the identifier response. I'll define a reference to it right away. Since the user clicked the send button and the response from the large language model may take a moment, it would be good to inform the user that we are waiting for the response. Therefore, I'm changing the content of the div element. Now, let's define the core part of this function, which involves connecting to the LLM. We'll do this using the sendRequest function we defined earlier. We await its result and assign the response to the variable called response. In the next step, the user's response needs to be shown. This is simple and just requires replacing the content of response div with the received text. That's all we need for basic functionality. Now it's a good idea to run a test. I need to refresh the page by pressing Ctrl+R to get the new version of the file. Let's type anything. An error from fetch function. Authorization is invalid header name. Fetch is used in the sendRequest function. I need to look into it. Here's the authorization. The mistake is obvious. Do you see it? Yes, exactly. This colon is unnecessary here. Because of it, the header is unknown. All right. Now the application is ready for testing again. As usual, you can't forget about the reload. It's showing as undefined. It seemed like it took a moment, so the connection probably went through, but something's still not quite right. I think I already know what it is. Exactly. This function simply hasn't been finished. At the moment when I defined the query using fetch, we moved on to defining scripts in the index.html, forgetting to return the response from the language model. Note that return is only executed when an error occurs. It remains to complete this function. First of all, we need to convert the response that came in JSON format into a JavaScript object and assign it to the variable data. And now the tricky part. because we need to return only the content of the response as text, and it was quite a complex object. Let's return to the documentation for a moment. Here we have a sample response. We are interested in the choices array, the message object, and then the content. We need to turn this into the return statement. The first element of the choices array, then message, and finally content. And that should be everything we need. I think the application should be working now. Let's test it and make sure there are no more errors. Always remember to reload the page. And the moment of truth, here you go. Everything works as I expected. We have a response from the AI. Alright, we've got our first working prototype, but we still need to tweak the interface design to make it more user-friendly. So, it's important to set up our cascading style sheets first. Let's start by adding a link to our new CSS file in the index.html. I will name the file rather conventionally as style.css. Of course, this file does not exist yet, so I need to create it in the editor. I've already got an empty file ready for the interface design, but I won't be doing it manually since this video isn't about creating interfaces or CSS. Instead, it's focused on programming in JavaScript. So I'll let artificial intelligence handle that part. I already have a tool for that, which is why I'm asking AI to help prepare a CSS file for my HTML. You could say we've created a program that almost builds itself. While it's not entirely autonomous, it's definitely a useful tool. And if this interface works as intended, it'll be the best proof of concept. I've pasted the HTML code of my page, and we'll see how the style comes together. It looks like we've got a response, and sure enough, a CSS file has come through. I'm going to copy its contents and paste them into the new file. Okay, here is the end. Further on, only additional explanations. Let's paste it into the file and see if it works. The code looks pretty standard. Sure, I could have requested a specific style, but let's check out what the AI has created for us. I just need to reload the page. There you have it. What a difference, right? It may not be mind-blowing, but it's definitely an improvement. I'm testing again to see if everything works correctly. Yes, everything works fine. The response came quickly, because it's Groq, that is known for fast inference. Before we dive into designing the complete chat interface, I want to show you how easily you can modify the tool's application. With this program, you can effortlessly turn it into a translation tool. But first, let's review our code to recap what we've accomplished up to this point. First, we set up a basic interface in HTML that includes a title, a single text field, a button, and a space to display the response. Then, we wrote a script that activates a function to query the AI whenever you click the send button. In the JavaScript file, we set up the basic parameters for the call, like the API key, endpoint, and model. Then, we created a function that connects to the large language model API and returns a response from it. Let's go ahead and focus on repurposing the tool. First off, I'll change the name, because obviously having the right name for the tool is crucial. Marketing is key after all. Believe it or not, we're already halfway through the changes we need to make. This is exactly how AI projects are built, quickly and efficiently. The second important adjustment is changing the system prompt. Like I mentioned, the AI receives the whole chat history. And crucially, there's a system prompt that directs the AI on what action to take. In this situation, I'm asking for a translation into Spanish. This is what we call setting context, something I've discussed numerous times in different videos where we've tested large language models. By the way, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on videos like these. I'm asking AI to give me just the translation so that we don't end up with extra text like "here's your translation" or anything like that. And just like that, with 2 small tweaks, the translation tool is ready to roll. We can start testing it now. Let's see how well it translates into Spanish using Llama. There you have it. Everything's working just as it should. That's great news. Let me check one more thing. Can you use this tool to translate the name of a tool? Obviously you can't search Google on Google because that might break the internet, but what about translating a translation tool? Great, it's working, nothing's broken, so it looks like it's definitely possible. But let's focus on serious things. At the start of this video, I promised we'd focus on creating an AI chat. A chat naturally involves having a conversation, which means exchanging multiple questions and answers. So, let's dive into what changes we need to make to build this kind of application. In various chat interfaces, you'll usually find the conversation section above where you type your message. So, let's go ahead and put a placeholder for the conversation right below the title. Speaking about the title, it also needs to be changed because it's no longer translation tool, but AI chat. The main concept behind any tool that interacts repeatedly with a large language model is to keep track of the conversation history. That's why in a chat we need a spot to store all the previous statements from both sides. Otherwise, without sending this history to the LLM each time, it would treat every interaction as a new conversation. That's why I've created a global array called chat history to store all the messages. Now we need to make sure we update this table at the right times. We can add the first message when we call the send request function, since the input at that moment is a new message from the user, and it can already be added to the history. Of course, the elements of the chat history array are objects with two keys, role and content. Content is in this case our input from the user. The next step is to update what we send to the LLM as messages. Instead of using the previous prompt, we'll now send our chat history. I will define a helper variable called AI response, where I will store the content of the response from AI. Besides returning it as the function's result, it should also be added to the chat history as a message from the assistant. It's an operation very similar to adding user content. Push places the element at the end of the array. The only thing that sets this apart is the role, because this content comes from the assistant, which is the AI, not from the user. We basically have the logic ready. The only thing left to handle is the index.html, where changes to the interface need to be made. But this is probably a good time to conduct some testing. The interface still functions the same way, but the AI should already remember our conversation history. That's why I'm introducing myself, and then I'll ask if it remembers my name to see if it recalls the context. Yes, everything is working fine. We just need to tweak how the interface behaves. Any changes we still need to make should be done in the index.html file. We already have a defined div element with the chat identifier that we will refer to. Therefore, I will define a variable in JavaScript to store a reference to this element. I've done this many times before, and you can use the function document.getElementById to do it. As soon as the user clicks send, there's nothing stopping their message from being added to the chat. I am adding this content as simple HTML, highlighting in bold who the message is from. The content of the message is, of course, the input that was taken from the text area with the identifier input. The next two lines refer to the response field, which we will no longer use because we have chat. The call to the send request function is correct because we still need a response. However, the next line again refers to the response element instead of chat, and this needs to be changed. There's nothing special about it. It'll look just like adding a message from the user 2 lines above. I could just copy that line and update it, but never mind. After receiving the response, the field where the user enters their queries needs to be cleared, so they can ask the next question. This is not Python, so semicolons at the end of statements are necessary. I need to add them. This is the point where, in my opinion, everything should be working properly, so we can move on to testing. Reloading the page is mandatory. Okay, I see two issues here. First, the text is way over to the left, which isn't good. Second, the input field for conversations hasn't been cleared. Other than that, the chat seems to be working well, so let's start by trying to fix these issues. Here is the cleaning of the text area, and I think I know what the problem is, but we will get back to that in a moment. First, the positioning of the chat. I don't have a good solution for this yet, and I don't want even to analyze that. But for now, I will add a div element as a container encompassing the entire application. If this doesn't help directly, then applying an appropriate style will probably solve the issue in the future. By the way, I removed the response element, which is no longer needed. Let's go back to clearing the text field. I think the problem here is that I assigned the value of this field to the variable input, and then I clear this variable, which is no longer related to this field. Therefore, I will define input as an HTML element, and refer to its content through the value property. This should help. Obviously, I have to change it in all the places where it refers to the input field value. And finally, also when clearing this field. Now I can get back to testing and check if there's been any improvement. Great, I see that the response field has disappeared just like we wanted, and the text box is cleared too. However, the text is still aligned to the left, but don't worry, we'll fix that shortly. Let me just double check to make sure the context is saved. Yes, it is, so let's get back to the fixes. Here's how I plan to tackle this problem. I'll add an identifier to our div container, and then have the AI generate new CSS. This time, I'll mention that I like the color green, and we'll see if the interface turns green. I copied the HTML code to the clipboard, and I'm preparing a prompt for the AI. I'm not asking for anything specific, just to keep the general color scheme in mind. But remember, there's a lot you can do here. You can request different appearance features, and by doing that, you can create a really great interface. By the way, our interface got duplicated, but we already have the response and CSS. I'll copy what I need. Then I will check what the problem with the interface is if it continues to occur with the new styles. I replaced the style.css file with new content. Let's see how it looks now. It's green. Let's see if it works. Here's the response. The interface might not look super modern, but it still has its charm. Let's check to make sure it still works and nothing is duplicated. It seems like everything should be fine. I think everything is working correctly and meets the chat criteria. So we developed an AI-based application, or actually 3 different ones. You have to admit, it wasn't too tough, right? It took us just half an hour, including the explanations, which breaks down to only about 10 minutes per application. That's a pretty impressive result. Plus, we only use JavaScript on the browser side, an approach that's not very common. Plus, the application is super versatile. Since most providers in the AI world support the API standard proposed by OpenAI, we can easily switch models, whether it's ChatGPT, one of Groq's models, or the reasoning model Deepseek R1. Just change these 3 lines in the code to point to the right provider, and that's it. Right now, DeepSeek models are getting a lot of attention because they've been making waves recently, so I think it's a great idea to try them out, and I highly recommend you experiment with them too. One of their biggest perks is their affordability without compromising quality. You can check them out for yourself, or you can watch my previous video where I show how to program in Python using the Deepseek API. Before we wrap up, there's something important to point out. Sure, this application could have been fully developed using just HTML and JavaScript. However, the catch is that your API key, which is supposed to stay confidential, would be exposed in the code. This means the application isn't ready to be published online as a website. It's meant for personal use only. Now, if you're set on making it public, there's nothing stopping you from fixing this issue. You could use a small backend like a reverse proxy to insert the API key on the fly. But we'll dive into that in another episode, as this one is already quite long. May your projects always be created as smoothly as this one. See you next time.